From the moment she was born, the world told her she was less worthy, less capable, less important. As a little black girl, she was often overlooked, her dreams dismissed as impossible, and her worth defined by the color of her skin. The adults around her never saw the fire in her eyes, always assuming she was too young, too powerless to rise above the weight of their prejudice. But what they failed to realize was that every moment of rejection, every cruel word, was only fueling her to prove them wrong. Before diving into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more inspiring stories like this one. The park lay beneath a heavy blanket of gray skies, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves and damp earth. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, but it was muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A few scattered trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches stripped of leaves, casting long, skeletal shadows on the ground. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a chill that crept beneath jackets and into bones. The park was nearly empty, save for a few souls scattered along the walking paths, each wrapped in their own thoughts, their own isolation. A couple sat quietly on a bench, their hands intertwined, the weight of something unspoken between them. A jogger passed by, his breath visible in the cold air, his footsteps quick, as if eager to leave the emptiness behind. And in the middle of it all, a small black girl, no older than 8, stood alone on the swings. Her feet barely touched the ground as she rocked back and forth, her movements slow and methodical, her gaze distant. The wind tugged at her hoodie, lifting her curly hair just slightly, but her expression was unchanged, focused, perhaps, on some far-off thought that only she could understand. Her name was Maya, and she had been coming to this park every afternoon since she could remember, drawn to its quiet solitude. But today, there was a weight in the air that she couldn't name, a heaviness that seemed to follow her as she swung higher and higher. The sound of the chains creaking was the only noise in the otherwise still park. Maya's hand gripped the chain tightly, her small knuckles white with the pressure, as she kicked her legs in the rhythm she had perfected over time. She could feel the cold biting at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. She had learned to ignore the cold, to ignore the world around her. It was easier that way. Then, a voice broke through the silence. "Hey, what are you doing here, little girl?" Maya froze, the swing slowing. Her eyes turned toward the voice, a man who was standing at the base of a slide. His face was twisted with a sneer, his body rigid with hostility. His appearance was unremarkable at first glance. Worn jeans, a faded jacket, and boots that seemed a little too heavy for the peaceful park. But there was something in the way he stood, something in the way he looked at her, that made Maya feel small, exposed. The man took a step closer, his boots crunching against the fallen leaves. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice low and threatening. "This is a place for people like me, not." He trailed off, his gaze sweeping over her with disdain. Maya's heart raced in her chest, but she didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. Her mother had always told her to stay quiet when strangers approached, to avoid confrontation. But there was something about the way this man spoke that made her want to shrink back into herself, to disappear. The man stepped forward again, this time standing directly in front of the swing, blocking her view of the park. He looked down at her with narrowed eyes, his lip curling in disgust. "What are you even doing here, huh? You think you can just come into places like this, like you belong?" Maya swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she had as much right to be here as anyone else, that she was just a kid, but the words caught in her throat. Fear had a way of stealing a person's voice, and she felt paralyzed in that moment, unsure of what to do. The man sneered at her again and raised his hand. Maya flinched, but before she could react, he brought his hand down, not to strike her, but to shove the swing hard. The force of it knocked her back, and for a split second, Maya felt the sharp sting of humiliation burn in her chest. The swing rattled violently as she struggled to maintain her balance, but the man didn't stop there. He stepped closer and, with a swift motion, slapped her across the face. Maya gasped, her cheek throbbing from the unexpected pain. The world seemed to slow around her. She blinked, stunned, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch her face, to make sense of what had just happened. But before she could say anything, the man's voice cracked through the air again. "You should know your place," he spat, his words venomous. At that moment, everything seemed to still. Maya's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She could feel the sting of her cheek, but it was the sting of his words that hurt more. She didn't know why he hated her. She didn't know why he had decided that she didn't belong. All she knew was that it didn't make sense. She had done nothing wrong. She was just a girl on a swing. The man took a step back, his face curling into a satisfied grin as he turned to leave. But before he could fully walk away, the sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance. The man froze, his eyes scanning the empty park. Then, from the other side of the field, a black SUV appeared, its tires crunching against the gravel of the parking lot. It was a sleek, imposing vehicle, and as it rolled to a stop, the driver's side door opened, revealing a tall figure, an imposing man dressed in a tailored suit. The man stood for a moment, his posture straight and confident, a quiet authority radiating from his very presence. He was tall, his skin a deep brown, his face carved with sharp lines, and his eyes cold but not unkind. He glanced over at Maya, who was still gripping the swing, her face now streaked with tears. His gaze hardened immediately, recognizing the scene unfolding in front of him. Maya's father had arrived. Detective Julian Carter, the chief of police, walked toward them with deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the man who had just assaulted his daughter. The wind seemed to hold its breath as Carter's footsteps echoed through the park. He had seen much in his career, violence, betrayal, death, but nothing quite like this. The rage that burned in his chest now was unlike anything he had ever felt. The man who had struck Maya turned quickly, his eyes wide with panic as Carter approached. He stumbled back a few steps, his bravado faltering in the face of the towering figure before him. Carter's voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it that made the man's spine stiffen. "What the hell did you just do?" Carter demanded. The racist man swallowed hard, his face paling as he realized the gravity of his mistake. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his tongue. Maya's father, the chief of police, had arrived, and the balance of power in the park had just shifted dramatically. Maya's father stood tall, every muscle in his body coiled with restraint. He had lived a life of calculated decisions, had spent years commanding the streets and working with the law. But today, in the stillness of the park, under the heavy weight of his daughter's tear-streaked face, his control slipped. The quiet breeze seemed to carry an almost tangible tension, as if the park itself was holding its breath. The man who had assaulted Maya took a cautious step back, his eyes flicking nervously from Carter to the ground, as if willing the earth to swallow him whole. But there was no escape, no place to hide. The harsh reality of what he had done was inescapable. It wasn't just that he had struck a child. It was that he had struck a child who was the daughter of one of the most powerful figures in the city, a man who commanded the respect of criminals, politicians, and anyone else who understood the force of the law. "Do you even know who I am?" Carter's voice sliced through the silence like a knife. The man stammered, his breath ragged and shallow. "I didn't mean," he began, his words stumbling over each other, but Carter's presence alone was enough to make him freeze. "I don't give a damn what you meant," Carter said, his eyes cold, every word dripping with authority. "You put your hands on my daughter, and now you'll answer for it." For a long, breathless moment, they stood there, the tension thick between them. The man's eyes darted desperately, calculating whether he had any chance of talking his way out of the situation. But the moment his gaze met Carter's, he knew there was no escape. The chief of police was not a man to be intimidated or cowed. He was a man of principle, of rules, rules that this man had just broken in the most unforgivable way. Maya stood frozen, still clutching the swing, her small frame trembling. Her cheek burned where the man's hand had struck her, and the sting had barely subsided. But it wasn't just the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the shame. She had always known that people could be cruel, but this man's cruelty had come without reason. It had been senseless. And now, to see her father standing there, in the middle of the park, in front of this stranger who had hurt her, made her feel even more exposed. Her throat tightened, and she could barely hold back the sob that threatened to spill from her chest. "Are you okay, baby?" Carter's voice softened as he approached her, crouching down in front of her. The anger in his eyes never wavered, but there was an undeniable tenderness in the way he reached out, gently lifting her chin to meet his gaze. Maya nodded slowly, but the tears continued to fall, her emotions a storm she couldn't control. She wanted to be brave. She wanted to stand tall like her father, but the world felt so big and so unsafe in that moment. Carter wiped away the tear that had slipped down her cheek, his heart heavy with an unspoken fear. Fear for what this moment would mean for his daughter in the world they lived in. "Maya, I need you to go sit on that bench over there, okay? Stay right there. I'll be with you in a second." Carter's voice was calm now, but there was an undeniable urgency in his words. He didn't want her anywhere near this man, not for another second. He could feel the pit in his stomach grow heavier as he watched her shuffle away, her small feet barely making a sound on the cold ground. But his focus quickly snapped back to the man in front of him. Carter stood, slowly, deliberately, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain still. He knew that anger, unchecked, led to poor decisions. He couldn't afford that today, not with everything on the line. The man, sensing Carter's anger, stammered again, this time with more desperation in his voice. "Please listen. I didn't mean it like that. I don't know what came over me. I just what?" Carter interrupted, his tone sharp and cutting. "You just decided that this little girl, my daughter, wasn't worth your time? You thought you could push her around because you thought she was beneath you? Because of what? Her skin, her color." The man opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had no defense. Nothing to say that would make this right. "You can't even begin to understand, can you?" Carter continued, his voice growing colder, sharper. "You don't know what it's like to live in her shoes. To grow up in this world, a world that judges you based on something as ridiculous as the color of your skin. She didn't do anything to you. She doesn't deserve this. And now you've made a choice that's going to haunt you for the rest of your life." The racist man stood frozen, staring at Carter, his expression a mixture of fear and shame. He had never expected this. Never expected the father of the girl he had assaulted to be someone like Carter. Someone so powerful, so in control, yet so unyielding in his conviction. Carter took a step closer, his presence looming over the man. "I'm not going to let you get away with this. You may think you can hide behind your hate, your ignorance, but you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." The man finally spoke, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear I didn't." Carter raised his hand, silencing him. "I don't care about your apologies. I care about justice, and you'll get what's coming to you." The man's eyes flicked nervously to the side, as though he was looking for an escape, a way out. But there was no escape, no way out of this. Carter took a deep breath, his jaw tight. He reached for his phone, quickly dialing the number he knew by heart. The sound of the ringing seemed to stretch out, each second a heavy weight in the air. When the call was answered, Carter didn't waste any time. "Detective Carter," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need you to get down here, now." As the dark gray sky slowly gave way to a muted twilight, Carter stood at the park's edge, his eyes fixed on the back of the man who had harmed his daughter. He had said his piece, made sure the man understood the weight of what he had done. But there was something more, something that clawed at him, a gnawing unease that wouldn't fade. His daughter had been hurt, yes. But what if this was just the beginning? What if this was a message? A shiver ran down Carter's spine, not from the chill in the air, but from a deep, unsettling instinct that was whispering warnings he couldn't ignore. He turned back toward Maya, watching her sitting on the bench, her small frame still trembling, though she had stopped crying. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, too innocent to understand fully the complexity of what had just transpired. She only knew she was hurt, and her father, her protector, had appeared just in time. But that wouldn't last forever, would it? His heart twisted in his chest as he approached her, every step weighed down with the realization that the world had just changed for her. She was no longer a little girl who could swing freely in the park, untouched by the world's hatred. Something darker had crept into their lives, and it was his responsibility to make sure she was safe from it. "Maya," he said softly, kneeling down beside her. She looked up at him, her face still pale, her eyes too knowing for her age. He cupped her face gently with his hands, as if grounding her in the moment, in the safety he could offer for now. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he whispered, brushing his thumb against her cheek. "I'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again." She nodded, though her lips trembled slightly. "I'm scared, Dad." The words hit him harder than any punch could. The simple, honest truth in them shook him to his core. His little girl was scared. Hey, he said, leaning in to pull her into a hug. "We're going to be okay. I promise." But as he wrapped his arms around her, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The vibration was a harsh interruption, jarring him from the moment of tenderness. He pulled back just enough to glance at the screen. The name that flashed there made his stomach tighten. Chief Anderson. Carter had known the call would come, but not this soon. He stood, pulling Maya gently to her feet. "Stay right here, okay? Don't go anywhere." Maya nodded, her eyes not leaving him. There was a quiet trust in her gaze, but also a question. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel safe. And for now, she was going to trust him to make everything right. Carter answered the phone, his voice steely as he spoke. "Anderson." "We need to talk," came the gruff voice on the other end. "It's about what happened today. I've already got a report from the officers who responded, and I'm sending someone to the park to get statements, but you need to be prepared. We've got a situation on our hands." Carter's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, a situation?" "Someone higher up is involved in this," Anderson said, the words carrying a weight that Carter hadn't expected. "This isn't just some random guy who decided to take a swing at a little girl. There's something bigger going on here. We're getting word from other sources that there's a movement starting, a dangerous one." Carter's mind raced. He had been preparing for a day full of paperwork, dealing with the aftermath of an assault on his daughter, but this was something else. "What kind of movement?" "I can't say much yet," Anderson replied, his voice tight. "But you need to meet me at the precinct. Now." Carter didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. He hung up the phone, his thoughts swirling as he looked at Maya one last time. There was a cold knot forming in his stomach. His protective instincts were in overdrive, but now something bigger was at play. Something more insidious than an isolated act of hate. He could feel it in his bones. "Maya," he said, crouching down to her level. "I need you to go straight home and stay there. Don't talk to anyone. Don't open the door for anyone. I'm going to take care of everything. I'll be back soon." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to protest, but she could see something in his face, something that scared her. It wasn't the fear of a father worried about his daughter. It was the fear of something deeper, something that she couldn't understand but could feel. "Okay, Dad," she whispered, nodding slowly. "Be safe." "I will," he promised, though he wasn't so sure of that himself. Carter turned on his heel and began walking briskly to his car. The air had become heavier, the darkness more oppressive, as if the night itself was holding its breath. His mind raced as he drove, the sound of his tires on the wet road the only thing that broke the eerie silence around him. When he reached the precinct, he was greeted by Chief Anderson, whose face was etched with concern. He led Carter through the dimly lit hallways to his office, where a few of the department's top officers were already gathered. "Carter," Anderson said, gesturing for him to sit. "We've got a serious problem." Carter took his seat, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "What's going on?" "We're getting word that this attack on your daughter wasn't random," Anderson began. "Someone has been orchestrating these kinds of incidents in the city, targeting vulnerable people, stirring up racial tensions. The man who attacked your daughter is just one part of a larger network." Carter's heart dropped. "What do you mean, a network?" "We think there's a group of people behind this, people with resources, with connections. They're trying to start something, trying to incite violence, and it's working. They're drawing people in." "And what about the man who attacked Maya?" Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're investigating, but the problem is he's not talking. And there's something off about his story. The police who questioned him are reporting inconsistencies. It's like he's been coached, like he's part of something bigger." A chilling realization swept over Carter, one that he couldn't shake. His daughter's attack wasn't just an isolated act of hatred. It was part of something far more dangerous, a conspiracy that reached farther than he ever could have imagined. And that wasn't the worst of it. "There's more," Anderson continued, his voice low. "We've just learned that there's a mole within the department. Someone on the inside is feeding information to this group." The room went silent, and Carter's blood ran cold. A mole. Someone he had worked with for years. Someone who knew his every move, his every weakness. Someone who could destroy everything he had built. "Do you have any leads?" Carter asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "We're working on it," Anderson said, but Carter could tell he wasn't convinced. "But we need to move fast. We're running out of time." Carter stood up, his decision made. "I'll handle this. I need to find out who's behind this, who's pulling the strings. And I'll make sure my daughter is safe. I'll do whatever it takes." As he left the precinct, the weight of a world seemed to press down on his shoulders. The city he had sworn to protect was being torn apart from the inside. His family was in danger. And the worst part, he couldn't trust anyone, not even the people he had worked beside for years. As Carter drove back toward his home, the shadows of betrayal loomed large in his mind, and he knew the fight for his family's safety was only just beginning. Carter walked into his house, the door creaking slightly as it shut behind him. The weight of the day hung heavy on his shoulders, and yet it was the silence of his home that gripped him the hardest. The house was too still, too quiet. No sound of Maya's laughter or footsteps running through the halls. No warmth of his wife, Liza, calling him in from the kitchen, asking about his day. The absence was suffocating, and Carter couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was slowly slipping through his fingers. He glanced toward the kitchen, where he knew Liza would be. She was always there when he came home, but today, the house felt like strangers, a reflection of his own disconnection. Liza was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her, her hands wrapped around it like a lifeline. She hadn't heard him come in, hadn't turned to acknowledge his presence. Carter stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She was still beautiful, though the lines of worry around her eyes had deepened over the years. The stress had taken a toll on both of them, but now it seemed to have taken a deeper root. He could see it in her posture, the way she sat there, her shoulders hunched in a way that hadn't been there before. Carter took a deep breath and crossed the room, his steps slow and deliberate. He was about to speak, but Liza beat him to it, her voice soft but laced with something sharper beneath the surface. "You're late." He paused, startled by the tension in her words. It wasn't the kind of greeting he was used to, not from her. "I was at the precinct," he said, sitting across from her. "There's been a development. Maya's attack, it wasn't random." Liza's eyes flickered with something, fear, concern, or maybe even something darker. But she didn't ask for details. She already knew something was off. He could see it in the way she was holding her breath, as though waiting for him to reveal something that would shatter her. "Tell me," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Carter leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, his fingers pressing into the wood. The weight of everything he had to tell her felt like it might crush him. "There's a network, Liza. A group of people behind what happened to Maya. It's not just about one man. It's about something much bigger. And we've got a mole in the department. Someone's feeding them information." Liza blinked, absorbing his words slowly, her mind struggling to process the weight of it all. Her eyes dropped to her hands, still gripping the teacup as if it were the only thing holding her together. "So this wasn't just some random act of violence?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady, her gaze not meeting his. "No," Carter replied, his voice hoarse. "This is just the beginning. I don't know who's behind it, but we're looking at something dangerous. And I don't know how deep it goes." Liza's lips pressed together into a thin line. Her hands tightened around the teacup, her knuckles white. "And you're just going to let them keep going? Let them hurt our daughter and tear this city apart?" Carter felt the sting of her words, even though they were spoken with quiet anger. He knew she was scared. Hell, he was scared too. But what hurt more than anything was the unspoken accusation in her voice. The idea that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't doing enough to protect his family. To protect her. "I'm doing everything I can, Liza," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, I'm doing everything I can. But this is bigger than us. We're up against something, someone, who has power, and I don't know who they are yet." Liza finally lifted her gaze, her eyes red-rimmed, but there was something else in them too. A flicker of distrust. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. You've been gone, Carter. You've been distant. And now this. What if this is more than just a case for you? What if this is something personal? Something you're not telling me?" The words hit Carter like a slap. He could feel the anger building inside him, but more than that, he felt a deep, gnawing sense of guilt. Guilt for all the times he had buried himself in his work, for all the times he had pushed her aside in favor of the badge. Guilt for not being the husband she needed, the father he should have been. "I'm not hiding anything from you, Liza," he said, his voice raw. "I've been trying to protect you both, but I can't do this alone." For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the tension hanging thick in the air. Carter wanted to reach out, to tell her everything was going to be okay, but he couldn't. Not when he wasn't even sure if it would be. Not when his own world was crumbling around him. Liza sighed, looking away, her gaze falling to the window where the first stars were beginning to appear in the night sky. "I don't know if I can keep waiting for you to come back to us, Carter. I don't know if I can keep being second place to whatever this is." The words stung, sharper than any physical blow. Carter felt his throat tighten, but he swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "I'm here, Liza. I'm here right now. I'm not going anywhere, but I need you to trust me. I need you to understand that what's happening is bigger than just us. It's bigger than anything we've faced before." She didn't respond, not right away. Instead, she stood up from the table, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were carefully considering every step. She walked to the kitchen counter, staring at the knife block for a moment before she spoke again, her voice low, almost fragile. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe it is bigger than us. But don't think for a second that I don't feel like I'm losing you, Carter. That I don't feel like I'm losing everything we've built." Carter stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew she was right. In some ways, he had been losing her for a long time. Losing the connection they had once shared. Losing the family they had fought so hard to build. And it was his fault. He had chosen his duty over her, over Maya. He had chosen the badge over his own flesh and blood. "I haven't given up on us, Liza," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need you to fight with me. We have to fight together." She didn't respond, but the look she gave him spoke volumes. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was fear. Fear that he was right, that there was something dangerous lurking on the horizon, something that neither of them could escape. As Carter watched her, he knew this moment was pivotal. It was the moment that could either tear them apart or bring them closer. He wasn't sure which one it would be, but he knew one thing for certain. Everything had changed. Carter stood in the middle of the precinct, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the faint echo of distant voices filling the air. His mind was still racing after the revelation he had just uncovered. Something about this case had gnawed at him from the start, something he couldn't put his finger on. But now, after hours of combing through files, interrogating witnesses, and piecing together the fragments, he had found the breakthrough. It wasn't just the syndicate targeting his daughter. It was something more personal. He glanced at the thick stack of evidence on his desk, his fingers hovering over the file labeled confidential. It was the same file that had been untouched for days, the one that had been sitting in his office, waiting for him to open it. As soon as he did, everything shifted. The contents inside were damning. One name stood out above all the others. A name he hadn't expected. A name that sent a cold chill down his spine. Liza. He had seen her name mentioned before, but at first he thought it was a coincidence. Now, the more he looked at the pieces of the puzzle, the more it became undeniable. She had been involved in something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The weight of the revelation hit him like a brick wall. How could he have missed this? How could he have trusted her? Every fiber of his being told him that the woman he had married, the woman who had stood by him through everything, was hiding something from him. He couldn't breathe. Liza had never spoken about her past. But as Carter looked closer at the documents, he saw the connections: shady financial transactions, coded communications, and meetings with individuals whose names didn't sit well. The truth was there, staring him in the face. Liza had been part of the very syndicate he had been chasing. She had been feeding them information all along. The betrayal stung like acid, burning through his every thought, his every hope. He could feel the floor beneath him unsteady, his grip tightening on the desk as he tried to steady himself. This was the twist he hadn't been prepared for. This was the thing that would fracture everything he thought he knew about his life, about his family. He had trusted her with everything. The door to his office creaked open, and Carter didn't even need to look up. He knew who it was. He could feel her presence even before she stepped into the room. Liza. Her silhouette filled the doorway, a hesitant figure bathed in the dim light of the hallway. She had always been graceful, her presence a calming force that grounded him, that kept him tethered to the world. But now, standing before him, she was nothing more than a stranger. The weight of her silence was deafening, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Carter took a breath, the air thick with tension. "Liza, what is this?" His voice broke through the silence like a crack in glass, shattering the moment. "What's going on?" Liza stepped further into the room, her face unreadable, her eyes avoiding his. She had always been able to look him in the eye, to comfort him with her gaze when things were hard. But not now. Not anymore. The distance between them felt insurmountable. "You weren't supposed to find out," she said softly, almost too softly. There was no denial in her voice, no attempt to shield herself from the truth. It was as though she had already made her peace with whatever was happening, whatever was about to unfold. Carter's stomach twisted into knots. He felt like the ground beneath him was giving way, and his heart was racing in his chest. Every word she spoke made it harder to breathe. Why? The word was a gasp, a desperate plea for answers. Why, Liza? After everything, after all we've been through. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with something he couldn't place, regret, sorrow, or maybe something darker. She opened her mouth, as if to speak, but then closed it again. A wave of emotion passed over her face, but Carter saw the cracks in her resolve. The woman he had loved, the woman who had been his partner for so long, was crumbling in front of him. "You don't understand, Carter. You never did." Her voice broke on the last word. "I never had a choice." The words hit him like a blow, and for a moment, he couldn't process what she was saying. She never had a choice. What was she talking about? They had built a life together. They had fought together. She had promised him, promised Maya, that they would be safe. But now it was all unraveling. Now he understood that none of it had been real. It had all been a lie. "What do you mean?" "You could have walked away," he said, his voice rising. "You could have told me. We could have." She shook her head, cutting him off. "No, Carter, you don't get it. They threatened us. They know everything. They knew about Maya before we even did. They knew about you before you ever stepped into this precinct. They've had eyes on us for years." Carter froze. He couldn't breathe. What? The word was barely a whisper. They've been watching us. Watching you. Watching Maya. All along. Her voice was trembling now, the cracks in her composure wide open. And I didn't have a choice, Carter. I had to protect you. I had to protect Maya. He stepped back, shaking his head. This is insane. You're telling me you've been working with them all this time? You've been feeding them information. You've been part of this conspiracy. Liza flinched at the accusation, her face a mask of guilt and shame. She closed her eyes briefly, as if fighting back tears. I never wanted this, Carter. I never wanted any of this. But they were going to hurt you. They were going to hurt Maya, and I couldn't let that happen. I had to keep you safe. Carter felt the walls closing in around him, the reality of the situation crashing down. His world, his family, everything he had believed in, was built on a lie. Liza hadn't just been keeping secrets from him. She had been a part of the very thing that had been hunting them. And now all he could think of was how everything was connected, how the strings he thought he had been pulling were actually in someone else's hands. I'm sorry, Carter, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt Maya. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't go to the police. If I had, I would have lost you both. The silence in the room was suffocating. Carter didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the only thing that escaped was a quiet, broken laugh. He couldn't understand this. He couldn't understand how the woman he had loved so completely could betray him in such a way. Liza reached out, her hand trembling. Carter, please don't leave. Don't turn your back on me. For the first time in years, Carter didn't know what to do. His world was shattered, and the one person he thought he could trust had turned into someone he didn't recognize. The betrayal was too much, and as he stared at her outstretched hand, he felt something deep within him break for good. Carter sat in his car, staring blankly at the flashing lights of the precinct in the distance. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders, and the more he tried to make sense of it, the more the pieces of his life scattered like broken glass. Liza's betrayal hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating him. His thoughts churned, the noise in his head deafening, as he tried to reconcile what she had said with the life they had built together. How had he been so blind? Carter had always prided himself on being vigilant, on seeing the truth even when it wasn't clear. But now, in the quiet of his car, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the distant city sounds to accompany him, he felt utterly lost. The walls of his life were crumbling, and every truth he had clung to was now a lie. He ran his fingers through his hair, frustration boiling beneath his skin. His thoughts turned to Maya, his daughter, and the fear that had been gnawing at him since her involvement in the case had come to light. He couldn't keep pretending that things were going to be okay, that they could somehow return to normal. The dark world Liza had been hiding had found its way into their lives, and now he couldn't protect her. Not the way he wanted to, not the way she deserved. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from his partner, Mark. Carter, we've got a lead. Meet me at the warehouse in 20 minutes. A lead. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly started the engine. Whatever this lead was, it had to be important. It was his chance to finally do something, anything, to get his life back on track. But as he sped down the dark streets, another question gnawed at him. Was this just another trap? Another step deeper into a world he didn't understand? Or was this the break he needed to put everything together? The closer he got to the warehouse, the more his pulse quickened. The industrial complex loomed ahead, casting long shadows in the moonlight. He parked his car a few blocks away, moving swiftly toward the entrance. His breath formed a mist in the cold night air, his instincts on high alert. Something didn't feel right. The whole situation felt off, like a storm brewing in the distance. When he finally reached the warehouse, he saw Mark standing outside, looking uneasy. His partner had always been solid, dependable, but tonight he was tense, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone or something to jump out of the shadows. Carter. Mark greeted him with a tight nod, his voice low. You got message? Yeah, Carter replied, eyes scanning the area. What's going on? What's the lead? Mark hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the door of the warehouse. There's something here. Something big. It's not just the syndicate we're up against. There's someone inside who has a connection to everything. Carter felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Who? Mark looked around again, clearly reluctant to say the name. Someone you might not want to hear about, but you need to know the truth. The silence between them was heavy. Carter's mind raced as he searched for a hint, a clue. He couldn't let the mystery linger. Not now. Not after everything that had already happened. Who, Mark? Carter's voice was insistent, desperate for clarity. Mark swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. It's Liza. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Carter's blood ran cold. He took a step back, unable to process what Mark had just said. Liza, the woman he had loved, the one person who had been by his side through thick and thin, was connected to all of this, to the syndicate, to the threats on their lives, to everything that had gone wrong. No, Carter said, shaking his head in disbelief. It can't be. She's my wife. She's not part of this. She was protecting us. Mark held up a hand, his face grave. I know how you feel, Carter. I know you're looking for an excuse, but you need to hear me out. We found evidence, something big, that ties her to the operation. She's not just caught in the middle. She's a player, and she's been working with them for years. Carter's mind spun. He couldn't fathom the words. The life he thought he knew, the one he had tried so hard to protect, was slipping away. Everything he had fought for, everything he had trusted, was built on a lie. I need to talk to her, Carter said, his voice hollow. His decision was made in an instant, but the uncertainty in his heart left him with no real conviction. The man who had always solved cases with cold logic was now grasping at straws, searching for any sign of hope. I don't know if that's a good idea, Carter, Mark warned, grabbing his arm as he tried to turn away. This isn't something you can fix. Not like this. I have to, Carter insisted. I need to hear it from her. Mark stared at him, his expression filled with regret. I get it, but you need to be prepared for whatever happens next. With that, Carter stormed off toward the warehouse, ignoring the gut-wrenching feeling that gnawed at him. He could hear Mark's footsteps behind him, but he didn't look back. This was his battle now. He had to confront Liza. There was no other way. The door to the warehouse creaked as Carter pushed it open, the faint sound of his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The air inside was thick, stale, with the scent of metal and machinery lingering in the shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, but he pressed on. For Maya, for justice. As he ventured deeper into the heart of the warehouse, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Liza. She was standing near a stack of crates, her back to him. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, her posture tense. She didn't turn around when she heard him approach. She didn't have to. You're here, she said quietly, almost as if she had been waiting for him all along. I knew you would come. Carter's heart raced, his body feeling like it was made of stone. He could barely bring himself to speak. His voice came out ragged, strained. Why, Liza, why did you lie to me? All these years, all this time, and you didn't tell me the truth. Liza turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Because you weren't supposed to be involved, Carter. I didn't want you to get hurt. I didn't want to pull you into this world, but I had no choice. They have too much power, too much control. Carter shook his head, struggling to understand. You lied to me, to our daughter. For what? To protect us? Or to protect yourself? She flinched at the accusation, her voice trembling as she took a step forward. I did what I had to do. I didn't want to betray you, but I had no other choice. You were the one who kept us safe, and I couldn't let that go. The distance between them was closing, but instead of bringing them closer, it only deepened the chasm between them. Carter could feel the weight of every unspoken word, every lie, crashing down on him. I don't know who you are anymore, Liza, he whispered, the finality in his tone making her pause. She reached out toward him, but he took a step back, the walls inside him higher than ever before. "Carter, please. I don't know if I can ever forgive you." He cut her off, the pain in his voice raw. The emotional toll of everything he had uncovered, everything he had sacrificed, was too much. As Liza stood in front of him, her eyes pleading, Carter realized that his life, his journey, had just taken a dark turn. The choice he had to make was no longer just about truth or justice. It was about survival. And even then, he wasn't sure which path would lead him out of the storm. The night air was thick with anticipation, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant hum of the city. The rain had begun to fall in a steady, rhythmic pattern, the sound of droplets hitting the pavement echoing through the deserted streets like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Carter stood at the edge of the alley, his body tense and his mind whirling. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn back, to avoid the confrontation ahead. But he couldn't. Not anymore. The truth had been ripped from him piece by piece, each revelation more painful than the last. Liza's betrayal had shattered him, but it was what he had discovered in the darkness of that warehouse that had truly torn the fabric of his reality apart. His wife, his partner, had been working with the very people he had sworn to bring down. The line between ally and enemy had blurred beyond recognition. And now, here he was, standing on the precipice of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The storm had come, and it wasn't just a metaphor. The rain fell harder, the world around him darkening, as though the heavens themselves were conspiring against him. His mind was racing, replaying every moment, every choice he had made that had led him to this point. Had he been blind to it all? Had he missed the signs? He couldn't afford to waste time in self-doubt. There was no going back. Carter had made his choice, and now he had to see it through. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he stepped forward, the sounds of the city fading into the background as he focused solely on the mission at hand. This wasn't just about right and wrong anymore. It was about survival, and not just his own. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, and Carter spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his side. But the figure that emerged from the darkness wasn't one of the men he'd been hunting. It was Liza. She stepped into the dim light, her eyes dark and distant, her face drenched by the rain but unreadable. Carter's heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of rage and heartbreak rising within him. What had she come for now? To make excuses? To beg for forgiveness? He didn't know if he could stomach any more lies. "You're here," Carter said, his voice colder than he had intended. "I didn't think you'd show up. After everything you did, I didn't think you'd come." Liza didn't flinch at his words, though they clearly cut deep. Her eyes were fixed on him, filled with something that was both sorrow and defiance. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "I didn't know how to fix this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to make you understand. I never wanted to hurt you." The rain fell in torrents now, washing away the dirt from the streets, but doing nothing to cleanse the raw emotions between them. Carter couldn't bring himself to believe her anymore. Not after everything. Not after she had pulled him into a web of lies, after she had endangered their family. He shook his head, the flood of anger and betrayal surging within him, drowning out any trace of compassion. "You don't get to say that. Not after everything you've done. You don't get to come here and tell me that you didn't want to hurt me. You've been lying to me, to Maya, to everyone, and now you want to act like you're the victim." Liza took a step forward, her face twisted with pain. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Carter. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm telling you the truth now, even if it's too late. The truth about what's really been going on, what they've been planning, what they want from you." Carter's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, all of the noise in his head stopped. He looked at Liza, his eyes narrowing, his mind trying to process her words. "What do you mean? Who are they? What do they want?" "They're not just some crime syndicate," Liza explained, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had to say. "They're planning something bigger, Carter. something that will change everything. And they won't stop until they have you, your position, your influence. You're part of their plan, whether you like it or not. Carter's mind reeled, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but not in a way that made any sense. Why didn't you tell me? Why keep it all a secret? I was protecting you, she replied bitterly. I was protecting us. I didn't have a choice, Carter. They're powerful. They don't care about family. They don't care about loyalty. They care about control. If I hadn't done what they asked, they would have killed us both. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The fear and desperation in Liza's eyes were undeniable, but they couldn't undo the years of deception. They couldn't take back the lies, the betrayal, the manipulation. But despite everything, despite the darkness that had overtaken their lives, there was still a part of him that wanted to believe her. There was still a part of him that ached for the woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with. The moments stretched between them, thick with the unspoken weight of all that had transpired. And then, just as Carter opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything, there was a sudden burst of noise. A sharp crack, a gunshot. Everything happened in an instant. Carter's instincts kicked in before his mind could fully process what was happening. He dropped to the ground, his body moving on pure reflex. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, his hand fumbling for his gun, trying to locate the source of the attack. Liza fell to the ground beside him, her body jerking as a second shot rang out, this one too close for comfort. "Carter, get down!" she shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him into the shadow of a nearby dumpster. His mind raced, the adrenaline flooding his system as he struggled to focus. Who had fired the shots? Were they here to kill him? Kill them both? The answers didn't come fast enough. All he knew was that the clock was ticking, and whatever was happening, it was happening fast. He leaned against the cold brick wall, trying to steady his breath as the chaos swirled around him. Liza was trembling beside him, her eyes wide with fear. Carter could see the truth in her face now, not just the guilt, but the fear of what was coming next. And it wasn't just the danger to their lives. It was the danger to everything they had ever known. Who's behind this? Carter demanded, his voice low and strained. Liza swallowed hard. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I know it's not over. This is just the beginning." The air around them crackled with tension, every second stretching painfully as the storm outside raged on. Carter's mind was a blur of thoughts, of questions he had no answers for. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if the very foundation of his world was crumbling. He looked at Liza, his mind torn between the woman he had once loved and the reality of the situation. There was no more room for half-truths, no more space for false hope. He had to make a choice, and it had to be now. With one last glance at Liza, Carter stood up, the decision clear in his mind. Whatever the truth was, whatever the cost, he was ready to face it. The world was quiet again, though not in the way it had been before. There were no more gunshots, no more shouting, no more fighting. The rain had stopped falling, leaving a stillness in the air that was both unnerving and heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The streets were slick, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights that seemed too weak to pierce the gloom. Carter stood at the edge of the parking lot, staring into the darkness. The echo of the chaos that had just unfolded still rang in his ears. Liza's frantic words, the gunfire, the way everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. And yet, amidst it all, there was a sense of clarity now. A quiet that felt like an end, even if he wasn't entirely sure what that end meant. The sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. It was the sound of the authorities coming to clean up the mess that had been left behind. Bodies, broken alliances, a shattered sense of trust. Carter didn't need to look to know that the police would be here soon. They had already found him. Or had he found them? He exhaled, his breath leaving a mist in the cool night air. The weight of the gun in his hand had gone unnoticed until now. He hadn't realized he was still holding it, still gripping it, as if it were a lifeline, but it had been his anchor in the storm. Now, it felt like an unnecessary burden. He turned it over in his hand once, twice, before letting it drop to the ground with a dull thud. The sound was oddly final. Behind him, Liza stood, her back against the brick wall of the alley, arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold herself together with sheer willpower. She didn't say anything. What was there left to say? The truth had already been laid bare. She had betrayed him. She had lied. She had put their lives at risk. And yet, she was still here, still standing, though not for much longer. Her future was uncertain, as was his. But one thing was certain. The man she had once loved was not the man standing in front of her now. "I should have told you," Liza finally said, her voice raw, her words heavy with the pain of regret. "I should have told you everything. I never should have gotten involved with them. I never should have let you get dragged into this." Carter turned slowly, his face unreadable, the remnants of his rage and heartbreak simmering beneath the surface. He didn't trust himself to speak, to say anything that wouldn't come out wrong. The anger was still there, but so was the grief. He had lost more than just his wife. He had lost the person he thought he could trust the most in the world. But it wasn't just betrayal that stung. It was the betrayal of everything they had worked for. The trust, the shared dreams, the quiet moments when it had all felt so simple. And now, in the silence that followed the chaos, it all seemed so far away. Could he ever get that back? Could they? "I know," Carter said finally, his voice strained but steady. "But it's too late for apologies, Liza. I don't even know if I can forgive you for what you did. Not yet." The truth hung between them, a jagged, painful thing that neither of them could escape. And though Liza nodded, understanding the weight of his words, she didn't seem to be looking for forgiveness anymore. She had already accepted that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, closer. Carter didn't turn around. He could feel the presence of the law closing in, the finality of it all settling over him. His heart was still pounding, the adrenaline still surging in his veins, but it was different now. The fight was over. He had survived. But at what cost? "I'll take the fall for this," Liza said suddenly, her voice resolute. Carter looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Liza continued, "I'm the one who got us into this mess. I'll take the blame. I'll face the consequences." "No," Carter said sharply, his voice colder than it had been in days. "You've already done enough. You don't get to sacrifice yourself like that. Not for me. Not for anyone." Liza met his eyes for a long moment, her expression a mixture of determination and resignation. She had already made up her mind. "I owe it to you," she whispered. "I owe it to Maya, to all of us." Carter shook his head, the sharp edge of his grief cutting through him once more. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she couldn't do this, that it wasn't her burden to bear alone. But the truth was, he had no right to dictate what she should or shouldn't do. She had already made the decision to walk down this dark path. And now, the consequences were hers to face. As the sirens grew louder, Carter's mind raced, and the weight of his choices threatened to overwhelm him. What would he do now? What was left for him to salvage? Maya needed him. His job, his life, it all needed him. But could he go back to the life he had known before? Could he put the pieces of his world back together after everything that had happened? For a moment, he felt completely alone. The chaos, the violence, the deception, had it all been for nothing? His chest tightened as the realization settled in. There was no going back. The damage had been done. The first police car pulled into the lot, its flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the scene. Carter could hear the footsteps of the officers getting closer, but he couldn't bring himself to move. It was over. The final act was being written, and there was nothing more he could do to change it. As the officers approached, one of them called out to Carter, but he didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching as Liza stepped away, ready to face whatever consequences awaited her. The sound of their voices blurred into the background as Carter's thoughts drifted to Maya. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to gather his thoughts, trying to find some sense of closure. His life was torn apart, but Maya still needed him. He couldn't let this be the end of his story. And then, as the weight of everything finally crashed down on him, Carter realized something. It wasn't the mistakes that defined him. It wasn't the betrayals or the regrets. It was what he did next. It was the choices he made moving forward. With a heavy heart, Carter took a step forward, his eyes locking with Liza's one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly, his voice filled with something unspoken, something that neither of them could fully comprehend yet. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the past behind. As Carter walked away from everything he had once known, he didn't feel the relief he had expected. Instead, he felt a deep sense of loss. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing. He had to keep moving forward, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions. The rain had stopped, and the air was finally clear, but would take time for the storm inside of him to pass. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.